I want to begin this afternoon with a few observations on the rather abrupt end to the President's case. It's clear, I think, today that they are still reeling from the revelation of John Bolton's book and what he has to say, the very relevant and probative quality of the testimony that he should give the Senate. As I'm sure you've seen, the President's own former Chief of Staff, General Kelly, has stated that he believes John Bolton, and more importantly, and that is extraordinary in and of itself, that the President's own former Chief of Staff believes John Bolton and by implication does not believe the President of the United States that he worked closely with for such a long time. But more importantly, he also recognizes the importance of calling John Bolton as a witness, of swearing him in, of letting the senators hear from themselves that very relevant testimony. The President's lawyers today and in their prior presentations really cannot defend the President on the facts. Instead, they used their time on the floor today to go through a list of grievances, which I'm sure the President was delighted to hear, but nonetheless not particularly relevant to the charges against the President here today. They used their time in defense to smear the Bidens, an object that they unsuccessfully sought to do with the whole Ukraine scheme, attack the managers and other distractions. But in terms of the actual facts themselves, while they have at their disposal any number of administration officials and agency officials who worked with the President, by the President through this whole period of time, did they choose to rely on any of them, call any of them, hear from any of them that could come and testify and support the President's position? And the answer is not a single one, because none of them can. And the one that has now offered to come forward, they're determined to try to prevent. But I don't think, frankly, that we could have made as effective a case for John Bolton's testimony as the President's own lawyers. And part of the way they did that today was the bulk of Mr. Sekulow's argument was, this is merely a policy difference. That's all this is. They're seeking to impeach the President over a policy difference. As if, as Sekulow would have us believe, Donald Trump released the military aid because he was so grateful that the Ukrainian parliament passed a anti-corruption court bill. And he was just waiting for that the whole time. Okay, no one believes that. No one believes that. I'm confident there isn't anyone in that chamber or anyone in the country who will buy that explanation. They make very few bones about it. One of the GOP senators remarking, I think publicly today, that we pretty much know the facts here. And we do. We know that the President withheld hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid from an ally at war in order to coerce that ally to helping him cheat in the next election. It is indefensible. And so what do they have to fall back on? They fall back on the argument that, okay, he did it. We all know he did it. But we're going to find a criminal defense lawyer whose expertise is not really constitutional law and who admits he is out of the consensus on this to come in and make the argument that is effectively the Constitution says so what. That abuse of power, you cannot impeach a president for abuse of power because it's too nebulous a concept. As if Article 1 simply reads abuse of power and it sets out nothing further, as if he has been impeached for the mere label abuse of power, as if the article didn't charge him with withholding military aid, a vital meeting, and seeking to get foreign help in his election to help him cheat. But of course, that's exactly what the article charges. And that is evidently what they cannot contest. And so the question, there are really two questions. The first is foundational, and that is, will there be a fair trial? Up until this point, all the senators have heard is argument. A fair trial involves witnesses, and it involves documents. So the question that will now be before the senators, they'll have questions for us in the next 2 days, but the question squarely before the senators is, will there be a fair trial? Will there be a trial that Americans overwhelmingly want, those that are for or against the President overly want the trial to be fair, which means the calling of witnesses. So that is the threshold issue that the Senate will have to decide. We know what those witnesses will say because they've said it already. They said it during the course of our proceedings, as we showed McMulvaney admitting that the aid was tied to these investigations, Sondland admitting that while the president claimed no quid pro quo, he effectively described a quid pro quo, that in order to get that military aid, the president of Ukraine was going to have to go to the mic and announce these investigations, and what's more, he should want to do it. So the question is, with a conduct that egregious, are we prepared to say that we will simply have to accept that in this president and future presidents, that we'll have to accept the idea that a president can so blatantly sacrifice the national security of his country in order to get help cheating in the next election? I think the founders would be astonished that anyone could even try to make that argument. Now, let me make one other point with respect to Mr. Bolton, because you've heard this refrain also. The House should have taken the year or 2 years that it would have taken to force John Bolton to testify. They should have forced him to testify. But I want you to hear what Donald Trump's lawyers at the Justice Department are saying, not in the Senate, but before the Court of Appeals on this subject. And this is in the Committee on Judiciary versus Don McGahn. Summary of argument. The committee lacks Article III standing to sue to enforce a congressional subpoena demanding testimony from an individual on matters related to his duties as an executive branch official. So here they are. The president's lawyers are this duplicitous, I kid you not. They come into the Senate, which they refer to as a court, and they say the House should have sued in court to enforce subpoenas on witnesses like John Bolton, and they go to court and they say the House may not sue in court to compel a witness to testify. That is the legal duplicity of the president's team. And it's in black and white. So that's basically it. Are we going to get a fair trial or are we not? Is the Senate going to hear from someone that every American now knows is a key and important witness on the most egregious of the president's conduct, or are we not? And I don't see how the oath of impartiality can be interpreted any other way than demanding a fair trial that includes witnesses and documents. We'll take some questions. Yes.
Are you confident enough that the Senate will call witnesses, that you're beginning preparations for that? If so, how? And Republicans have raised your name in some of these conversations. Are you yourself prepared to possibly be dragged into this?
Well, first, are we preparing? We have prepared for John Bolton. We have a lot more work to do to prepare now that we know more of what he is likely to say. But we will be prepared when the time comes. And at the end, I think at the most crucial is not the skill of his examination or cross-examination, but rather letting the senators evaluate his credibility, letting him tell his story, and not tell it in a book. Are we really going to require the country to wait until his book comes out to find out information that senators could have used to make the right decision on conviction or acquittal? In terms of the sort of red herrings, well, if the House managers want to call relevant witnesses, we want to call irrelevant ones, because we want to make them pay a price for getting witnesses who are at the heart of this scheme. That's not a game we're interested in playing. And well, I can tell you what my testimony is. He's guilty, and he should be impeached. And I think the idea is an absurd one, but then this is what you have to fall back on when you know just how damaging John Bolton's testimony is going to be. And I would say the same of Hunter Biden. If they want a witness for witness, then let them call McMulvaney. McMulvaney has said that he disputes what John Bolton has to say. Let them call McMulvaney. Let them call Secretary Pompeo. Let them call people that are percipient witnesses to this scandal and this corrupt scheme. If they want a witness for witness, but that's not really what they want. They want a distraction, and I don't think the senators want to allow their proceeding to be turned into a circus.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
Republicans are now arguing, Senator Paul among them, that John Bolton is not a credible witness. They're saying that his intentions might not be as clean as it is perceived to be. What would you say to that argument about Bolton's credibility? Are you concerned at all about how the American public will perceive him? Certainly some Republicans are trying to paint him as a person who has a vendetta and a grievance against the president.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to some. Yes, please.
Thank you. And the chairman has already so eloquently said that this trial and the Republicans' tactic is to create distractions, to distort, deceive, distract. I would be more concerned, based on the evidence that we have all heard, about the president's credibility. And if there are others, Republican senators out there or anyone else who has questions about John Bolton's credibility, well, he said he would testify. He said he would come in and testify under oath. So let's subpoena him so we can hear what he says. And the American people can make up their own minds about his credibility. But based on the evidence and overwhelming testimony that we have before us, I would be much more concerned about the president's credibility.
Let me add two things. Number one, it is fundamental in any trial that that you listen to the witnesses and you make the judgment as to whether the witness is credible and telling the truth. You don't not hear from the witness because maybe he's not going to tell the truth. If he's a relevant witness, you hear from him. That's what courts do every day in this land. Second of all, John Kelly, there's no reason to assume that Mr. Bolton isn't telling the truth. In fact, John Kelly, until recently the President's Chief of Staff, said this morning that he believes Bolton's account. I don't think you could have a better statement of belief than from the President's Chief of Staff. And what you're seeing is anyone who'll testify against the President, they're going to say is lying. And if we've got to keep him away from testifying, but if we can't keep him away from testifying, he must be lying. This is just nonsense.
Yes.
You talked about the criticism that you faced for not going after Bolton. You asked him to voluntarily appear. Why didn't you subpoena him to appear, just so you could say that you checked that box? And secondly, do you believe that the investigation that you ran was also impartial? Since that's some of the criticism that you've thrown at the Senate.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in terms of subpoenaing John Bolton, we could have subpoenaed John Bolton, but we subpoenaed his deputy first, and his deputy sued us. And it was very clear that John Bolton would tie us up in court for months or years. And his lawyer made that crystal clear. So there was little to be gained. We had made it clear at that point with respect to other witnesses that we had subpoenaed who were refusing to come in that we were not going to play this game of rope-a-dope endlessly in the courts. And allow the president essentially to obstruct the Congress with impunity, which is what he attempted to do by saying he was going to fight all subpoenas. So the fact that in the case we did bring against Don McGahn, they're arguing you don't have a standing to sue in court to enforce subpoenas shows just how disingenuous the president and his lawyers are. So that didn't make much sense. In terms of the impartiality, look, in the House of Representatives, we allowed the minority to suggest witnesses, and they did. We called witnesses in the open hearings that were proposed by the minority. In those super secret depositions they keep complaining about, there were as many members entitled to be there as the entire body of the U.S. Senate. They had every opportunity to ask all those questions in the depositions and the hearings, the same as the members of my party. And so they can complain and say it was partial or it was didn't have the same due process. They can make the argument, as they have repetitively, that we didn't get the same due process as in other impeachments. But the reality is they did. And I don't think those process grievances amount to very much. We'll take one last question. Yes.
The Senate does not decide, the majority of the Senate does not decide to subpoena and seek Mr. Bolton's testimony. Is that something the House would do to get his account out for the American people to judge, as Ms. Deming said?
You know, I'm not going to discuss what backup, fallback position there is, at the end of the day, nothing is sufficient if the Senate doesn't decide to have a fair trial. And you simply can't have a fair trial without witnesses. The resolution that Senator McConnell pushed through the Senate says that the witnesses have to be deposed before they testify. Now, the fig leaf of a justification that was given for that is, well, they deposed witnesses before their testimony in Clinton. Now, of course, in the Clinton case, it was the salacious quality of that testimony that led them to want to have those witnesses deposed so that all those unseemly questions that were asked in the deposition didn't have to be asked before the Senate. That's not the issue here. Why, if the senators have the opportunity to hear directly from John Bolton, would they, number one, not want to do it, and number two, even if they do it, want it to be done in a deposition form? After all the complaints they've made about depositions, it's very ironic that they're making such a strong case for a deposition here. But look, we're not in the investigative stage anymore. We are in the trial. And the triers of fact and the judges of the law, and the senators are both, should evaluate John Bolton's credibility for themselves. They don't have to take our word for it. Look, he's not exactly on the same policy page as many Democrats. They don't have to take John Kelly's word for it. They don't have to take the president's word for it. They can make their own judgment. But they can't do that if they refuse to even hear what he has to say. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mono, you doing a live shot? Lori, live shot? Okay, see you later.
Is this okay?
I don't think so, but that's something I would know. Okay, yeah.
Can you have them interrupt me just to make sure I'm still, hey,
So I can tear down?
perfect, yeah, hi Tanya.
Where should I go for this 345 question mark? It's not in the grid.
Hey, Alex, the Republicans
Should I
are
go
still in
staff
there.
all or
McConnell. Are
candidate?
they in McConnell's office or?
I don't think.
Yes, I can.
I think it's a conference meeting.
In this John Thurman room?
Confirming senators are in their conference. Yes, they're meeting at the conference room.